Hey everyone, Perry here. Just doing a little solo run here, wanting to talk about Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon again, and really address some of the criticism that the three-factor test that I've proposed has gotten. Some really good productive criticism that has led me to, uh, if not refine, at least understand the test a little bit better, and to maybe help with clarifying what the intent, what the purpose of the test is, how well it actually functions. We're going to look today at the Apocalypse of Abraham, which is a rather similar discovery. Well, this is a discovery to what the Book of Mormon narrative really puts forward. So with the Book of Mormon, you're supposed to have this ancient text that is written in a language that is only understood within this particular context, this Reformed Egyptian language that is in this Hebrew American, ancient Hebrew American context, um, and that is then translated into English. And so the only surviving manuscript that we have of the original source text is the English translation. That's all that survives this 19th century copy. Um, and then we translate from there. In the case of the Apocalypse of Abraham, you have what is purporting to be really, really much more ancient than the Book of Mormon, but that scholars have dated to the late first to the mid second century CE. That then gets passed down, and it only survives in these like 16th century Slavonic texts. So coming out of Bulgaria, Russia, um, and um, it only survives in these extant manuscripts in this far removed context from when it was supposed to, from what the scholarship is indicating, have actually been written. Um, so we're going to talk a little bit about that some of those similarities, and uh, try to kind of get past that superficial, like the separation of when the text is supposed to be sourced from, and then only appearing in this other language, and yet still being able to go back and argue for a Hebraic source. And so we'll do some look at that, and really parse out how the Book of Abraham, or sorry, the Book of Mormon, really does not meet the same standard the Apocalypse of Abraham is putting forward, and we'll actually show that the Apocalypse of Abraham is able to meaningfully meet the challenges of the three-factor test for Hebraisms, and that then leads into basically saying, okay, what did scholars actually say at this point? We have something that's really worth looking at here. What does the scholarship actually have to say? Um, my big source for this this video, for the presentation that's associated with that, is Dr. Amy Elizabeth Paulson Reed's doctoral dissertation from 2016. Um, and that is titled The Origins of the Apocalypse of Abraham. Uh, so that's primarily what I'm going to be using to support uh, this conversation. And just worth noting that Dr. Paulson Reed's work is also cited by FAIR, Scripture Central, these other sources that have this faithful LDS bent on trying to support the Book of Mormon. So we're using a common source, though I think that they would dive into some other specific articles from her that are a bit later on that I'm not touching on in this. I'm using her doctoral dissertation, but the stuff that she uses later on is echoed in, or those things echo what she writes in the dissertation. There's nothing that's too drastically different. But again, go to those sources, read them, and even read the sources that Dr. Paulson Reed cites. Don't just take my word for any of this. But we'll go ahead and dive into this conversation on the Apocalypse of Abraham and the three-factor test. So really, this is looking at how we find Hebraisms without a source text. So like how the Book of Mormon, we don't have the golden plates, and so we don't have that original source text. And one of the criticisms that I've put forward about making any apologetic argument to the translation and saying that it's Hebraic without that source text is we just don't have it. And so anytime you're trying to refer to it and say, hey, this is what the source text would have said, you're just kind of making this blind appeal. Well, In this case, we have the Apocrypha of Abraham. We don't have a source text, and so if we're trying to make certain arguments about the translation process, and how it would have come from Hebrew into the Slavonic text that we actually have. Oh, are we doing something that's meaningfully different from the Book of Mormon? Is it the same thing as my criticism? Therefore, maybe a bit unfounded, because we have this other instance where good scholarship, good competent scholarship has put the Apocrypha of Abraham into a Hebraic context. And that would be a fair criticism. So if that holds, great criticism, and that's something that would indicate that I need to go back to the drawing board. So we'll see. We'll take a look at that. So what is the Apocrypha of Abraham? It's a work of apocalyptic Jewish pseudepigrapha found only in the Slavonic copies. The translation was published in the Improvement era. So interestingly enough, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was super excited about this find. They published it in the Improvement era in 1898. And the reason why that's really why they did that was because they saw some superficial similarities in the narrative of the Apocalypse of Abraham to Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham. And so there was this idea of like, oh, hey, there's this older Jewish tradition that talks about these ideas of Abraham that are also seen in the Book of Abraham. Clearly, Joseph Smith wasn't just making it up. How could he have like gotten these ideas, these similar ideas? And that was the original kind of apologetic that was attached to this. And regardless of what explanations you want to come up for that, I'll refer you to Dr. Robert Rittner's takedown, really, of the Book of Abraham and its translation from the Breathing Permit of Horror. The Apocalypse of Abraham, it's called the Apocalypse of Abraham because it's apocalyptic in nature. It has a lot of apocalyptic imagery, especially of the type in nature that was consistent in the 1st century CE, 2nd century CE Judeo or Jewish Christian context. So you have the Apocalypse of John, the Book of Revelation, as we have it in the King James Version of the Bible today. That is an apocalyptic text. You have the Apocalypse of Daniel. That's a little bit older. And then the Apocalypse of Abraham is kind of in that same general genre of writing. And as noted before, so it only shows up in Slavonic copies, but scholars have been able to actually say certainly that, or with a reasonable amount of certainty, that the text is Hebraic in origin. Let's talk about that. So how is this actually done? Well, the first thing that's really noted is that the text has a provenance that puts it in a context of text coming from the Byzantines, the pseudepigrapha tradition that comes from the Byzantines. So you have Byzantine Byzantine Christians that are passing along orthodoxy and trying to spread it into, these pagan areas of Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, into the Slavic region, and Bulgaria and Russia at that time. And as they're pushing these ideas along, they're passing the canonized scriptures, but attached to that is the Apocrypha and a certain pseudepigrapha tradition. And that pseudepigrapha tradition becomes an endemic part of this Slavonic Christianity. And the Apocalypse of Abraham fits neatly into that. Because we found other texts within the pseudepigrapha tradition, and because the Apocalypse of Abraham fits neatly into that, the question for scholars becomes, isn't that whether or not this is a Slavonic text originally there. And some of that has to do with like a lot of the literary traditions that were actually present and native to the area at the time, which would not have produced a text like the Apocalypse of Abraham. So it fits into, was this, it's not the question of, is this a Slavonic text or a more ancient text? The question is it a Hellenistic text written in Greek, or is it a Semitic text written in Hebrew or Aramaic? And that exploration is actually really interesting because, well, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the Book of Mormon does not have that same kind of a context. The Book of Mormon is the only example of a an ancient Hebrew American text. There is no other example of something like it anywhere in any sort of scholarship. So it doesn't fit into any tradition, where the Apocalypse of Abraham decently does. And that allows us, with proper analysis, to be able to say, hey, because it's fitting into this tradition, we need to look at this either as a Hellenistic text or a Semitic text. And now the work needs to go in to show which one of these two traditions it actually fits into, which one of these two languages would it have actually been written in. So, as mentioned before, Dr. Amy Paulson Reed's doctoral dissertation really is the primary source for this presentation, this video. And her whole position ultimately is that she believes, like other scholars, that the text is Semitic rather than Hellenistic in origin. And the purpose of her dissertation was ultimately to take a lot of the sort of scattered scholarship that had been done on the Apocalypse of Abraham, in no small part scattered because it's written in these Slavonic languages, and it's hard to get that scholarship then translated into the English scholarship that would then be more widely distributed. And so it had really been relegated into this small niche area of scholarship, where if you couldn't read Russian or Bulgarian, you weren't going to be doing a whole lot of actual scholarship into this domain, or really engaging with the scholarship. And her work is part of this effort to try and consolidate these different ideas that have been put forward, and to show, like, this is the reason why, to actually make the case for scholars who are saying, well, the people who've actually studied it are saying that it's Hebraic. I don't really know, to actually give them a justification for accepting that good scholarship would put the Apocalypse of Abraham as a Hebraic text. And so among the arguments that she presents is a rather interesting paragraph. Let me see if I can dig that up here. And it came to pass. Sorry, I'm going to do a little search here. Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here. I'll go ahead and drop the slides there for a second. We'll pop that up. Hopefully you can read that okay. So here we have this idea that, or this paragraph for her discussing, like, the beginnings of the evidence for it being originally Semitic. And so I'm going to highlight here some of the reasons why. So regarding a possible Semitic original, scholars have pointed to phrases, idioms, calque, syntax, grammar, transliteration, and orthography in the Apocalypse of Abraham that all reflect these Semitic characteristics. These differ. They differ as to what kinds of conclusions can be drawn from them. Some of the elements that have drawn the most attention are the simple coordination of sentences that parallels the ubiquitous use of wa, that and particle, in Hebrew. And if you recall back to the Scripture Central video with Dr. Donald Perry that we used in our first video on the discussion of the three-factor test, this ubiquitous use of and as a connecting these phrases together was one of the pieces of evidence that he pointed to. The other is, like, uses phrases such as, like, here am I, and it came to pass. Remember, these are also coming up. And the construction of body parts in a metaphorical sense. I said in my heart, I said in myself. The similar ideas that would have come up as well in that Dr. Perry video were things like I dreamed a dream, or tax with a tax, those sorts of things. And we talked about why those weren't necessarily good evidences in and of themselves in that video, but you see it here showing up, and she's saying, hey, like, no, these are things that they have used. Well, let's go to the very, like, next paragraph. So this kind of evidence is actually the weakest for a Semitic Semitic original for the Apocalypse of Abraham. Since many scholars have discussed, elements of Hebraistic syntax and style are widely attested in the biblicizing Greek used by Hellenistic Jews, most notably in the Septuagint and New Testament. Okay, so basically what that's saying is that these types of phrases that show up, that were so common in in these other texts as being like Hebraic, seeming Hebraic, are also part of a common tradition of apologies for that. So this is part of a and so all of these examples are ultimately an example of the cases that you would find biblicizing Greek. You would find these Greek writers, these Jewish writers in the Greek-speaking diaspora, trying to sound like other biblical writers from before, and so they're mimicking that in the ways that they write down their sort of scripture sounding Greek. They're trying to sound scriptural. And so as they're developing these texts, they're doing the things that they see in the scriptures, but they're doing it in Greek. And so you would see these transitions, these phrases, these idioms, these syntaxes that appear in Hebrew, showing up in this sort of effort of trying to sound biblical. And that's one of the things that I argued in the last video as well, basically saying that if you look at like the Book of Armaments from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you see a really similar uh, structure, similar grammatical structure, similar cadence as what you find in the Book of Mormon, specifically with the pieces of evidence that Dr. Perry was discussing as being evidence of the Hebraic origin of the Book of Mormon. These things are just examples of essentially, in this case of the conversation of the Apocalypse of Abraham, what could be argued as biblicizing Greek, and in the case of the Book of Mormon, what I would argue as being biblicizing English, essentially just trying to sound King James enough to pass as being scriptural, and in so doing, capturing the sounds that are essentially Hebraic. And so this is where you would normally want to actually go through and show that certain names are transferred intact, or do other kinds of work, because we do not have the original like Greek that would have been passed along in the for the Apocalypse of Abraham. You can't do that direct analysis to then type back. So you use other techniques, other strategies, and that's one of the things that Dr. Paulson Reed discusses being an issue. It's one of the things that I presented as being a similar issue for the Book of Mormon. So what I'm already noticing, kind of as I was reading through Dr. Paulson Reed's analysis, is that the very evidence that Dr. Perry is citing in his Scripture Central interview is the same sort of evidence that would not be convincing to scholars trying to make this distinction when you already have the provenance to suggest the text is either Semitic or Hellenistic. If they only had that to go off of, it wouldn't be convincing to say that it was Semitic in origin. That wouldn't necessarily mean that you would go with arguing that's Hellenistic. You just wouldn't have sufficient evidence to really say that it's Semitic. And in the case of the Book of Mormon, where there isn't that tradition, that provenance to fit into, it's even less convincing. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that for a minute. We're going to come back to Dr. Paulson Reed's article, or her dissertation, here in a little bit when we as we move forward. But for now, the best evidence that that Dr. Paulson Reed actually, according to her argumentation, is really when you're able to take the text and understand it from a Hebraic perspective, and the text makes way more sense. So essentially, like if there's a situation where the text itself doesn't actually make sense as written, there's just kind of weird things happening, but once you put a Hebraic understanding on it, suddenly everything makes sense. That's a really good evidence that the text is Semitic in origin. So let's go ahead and take a look at a particular example. So this is I'll do a little bit of reading from her dissertation here in a second. But what we have in the Apocalypse of Abraham is the story of these idol gods. And the idol gods are, they are given names that by the time it gets down into the Slavonic, have maybe lost some of that some of the characters, some of the sounds that would have made it consistent with a Hebraic origin. But we can still try and reconstruct them. And so because we're trying to go back and reconstruct these names and trying to see what would have informed the Slavonic, we have to make some inferences and the like. And sometimes you see something that works great in as a Hellenistic source, factoring in, and so it doesn't rule out the potential that it's a Hellenistic text. But there is this one really interesting case, and that is the case of Verisat. And when you render Verisat back into the Hebrew, you do this reverse construction. You can get bar eshat, with some of these sounds like not actually preserved properly in the Slavonic, but showing up just fine back in the Hebrew. And what that translates to is son of fire. And there's this really, really interesting wordplay that happens here. And I think this is actually a part where Dr. Paulson Reed's writing actually kind of comes alive. I think that she enjoys this part quite well, as finds it pretty interesting. And so when you know that, I'm going to go ahead and pop her dissertation back up onto the screen here. Apologies. When you take this name Verisat and you understand it as being a fire god, thanks to the Hebrew, it helps with understanding some of the nuances that appear here in the Apocalypse of Abraham, which contains a humorous story about him in which fire is a central element. So we'll go ahead and read here the quoted text from the Apocalypse of Abraham. Looks like it's Abraham 5:17. And it came to pass, when I was collecting the wooden splinters, I found among them a small god lying among the pieces of wood on my left, and on his forehead was written God Beresheth. So this is the rendering it back into the Hebrew. So we could read it originally in this Slavonic as God Verisat, but we'll read it here in the Hebrew Barashaf. After I put the splinters on the fire in order to cook food for my father, so destroying this wooden god, this idol that's supposed to be the fire god, I went out to ask about the food, and I put Barashaf near the heart of the fire, saying to him menacingly, Barashaf, make sure that the fire does not go out before I come back. So he's mocking the god, you're the son of fire. Make sure the fire doesn't go out. When I came back again, I found Barashaf fallen backwards, his feet enveloped in fire and terribly burned. Laughing greatly to myself, I said, Barashaf, you certainly are able to kindle fire and cook food. And it came to pass while I was speaking laughingly that he was gradually burned up by fire and became ashes. Again, so there's this humorous story of Abraham mocking the god that is supposed to be the fire god, and yet it's being destroyed, being consumed by the flames. And I brought the food to my father, and he ate. And I gave him wine and milk, and he drank and satisfied himself, and blessed Maromoth, his god. And I said to him, Father Terah, do not bless your god Maromoth, do not praise him. Praise rather your god Barashaf, because in his love for you, he threw himself into the fire in order to cook you food. And he said to me, and where is he now? He has been reduced to ashes in the fury of fire and become dust. So yeah, you have Terah, the idol worshiping father of Abraham, wondering where his, asking after his God. You're trying to give thanks to one God, and Abraham says, it's not that God that helped you. It's Barashaf, the son of fire, that did this for you, and he is consumed in flame. And this is part of the, Abraham's argument that Adonai is the superior God, and that these idol gods are lesser deities. And so through understanding the Hebrew, we're better able to understand this text, where if we just had the name Barasat removed from any sort of context, any sort of other meaning, the story really wouldn't make as much sense. But if this God is the son of fire, it's humorous. There's actually a theological reason to include this story here, and to show the weakness of these idol gods. And interestingly enough, because of all of that, this particular section passes the three-factor test. So just the little bit of a reminder, we are looking at whether this text is Hellenistic or Semitic in origin. So we need to, instead of putting ourselves in the perspective of saying, I wonder if the Slavonic translator was actually working with a Hellenistic or a Semitic text, we're already able to go up to the point of saying, okay, this is Hellenistic or Semitic, and let's see what we actually get from that. So there's this the first is intentionality, right? So did the author intend on having this particular Hebraism? Well, when you don't actually have that Hebraism in the text, the story really doesn't function. So it's pretty clear that the author actually intended to have this wordplay showing up, this Hebraic wordplay. And it doesn't necessarily show up if you don't have a proper translation. Uniqueness. So is this unique? Does it actually belong to the Hebrew? And indeed, we see this like Barshoth name that works in Hebrew. It is a Hebraic, it's a Hebrew name, and it functions, it works, it makes sense. So yeah, we have, you wouldn't have this showing up in the Greek. You need the Hebrew to get this this transliteration all the way down to the Slavonic, and for that to actually make sense, right? You wouldn't have something that sounds similar to Varsat in Greek that would have this meaning that would then also work. You need to go to the Hebrew to make that work. And then unavailability within the milieu, right? So unless you are a Hebrew speaker and you know these particular words, these particular names, you aren't going to be able to come up with this. This isn't just biblicizing from some outside source, or it seems highly unlikely that if you're using the Septuagint or some other source like that, that you'd be able to come up with this this particular wordplay. Varasat or some variant thereof that actually works, that would appear in the Greek, doesn't actually show up anywhere in the Septuagint meaningfully. So it passes the three-factor test. So now we kick it over to, I mean, what do? We kick it over to scholarship, right? Really, so this is a good case study, right? So if there was a Hebraism in the Book of Mormon that passed the three-factor test, what we would do is send it over to scholarship to evaluate how good of evidence this actually is. So if we take a passing the three-factor test and it came to pass, right, at best we could call it weak evidence because it fits into this tradition of biblicizing language. And it's actually that biblicizing evidence that the three-factor test is one of the things that the three-factor test is trying to capture and trying to eliminate from the consideration as good quality evidence for an ancient origin of the Book of Mormon. And when we actually kick this this Verasat case over into scholarship, we see Paulson Reed cites Louis Ginsburg and James H. Charlesworth as kind of earlier strong advocates of this particular story being compelling evidence of a Semitic origin for the text. It was just one of those examples that came up. I thought it was really interesting. As I was reading through the dissertation, I think that Dr. Paulson Reed also really enjoyed this particular section. Her writing kind of comes to life in that section as she's describing it and discussing it. There are other sections that she seems pretty excited about, and this was one that I think that she really enjoyed. So let's talk about Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon. Let's do some comparison here. So I can think of three examples of kind of quality arguments for Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon. These are the ones that I find that do the best in the three-factor test, or at least are the most interesting, that have taken me the most time to really dive in, to analyze and understand. And I want you to understand that all of these we're actually going to, as we go through the Come Follow Me series, they will be featured and discussed as evidence for the Book of Mormon when we get there. I'm really just going to lightly touch on them here. I'm not going to dive too deep into that because this is really dealing with like the Apocalypse of Abraham, and I want to contrast that against like how we would look at that with the Book of Mormon. So chiasmus in Alma 36 is actually pretty interesting, though there is some pushback and some reasonable pushback that it isn't really a true chiasmus. Certain things are out of order, but it does largely feel like a chiastic structure. I am, in my position, pretty comfortable with accepting that it at least has the feel of being chiastic. And obviously what we'd have to divorce this from is, is this an example of biblicizing doing a biblicizing English? And can we really remove it in terms of its intentionality from the sort of the repetitive structure of an oral dictation? And that's really one of the most common issues with the chiasm arguments in the Book of Mormon. I don't find it particularly strong evidence. I don't think that it actually passes the three-factor test because of the intentionality, and because we do see evidences of chiasms in the King James Bible. It's not that I think that Joseph Smith per se was going in and saying, "Oh, I'm going to put a chiasm here because it's going to sound like Scripture." It's more because he's got this sense of what Scripture sounds like. He's going through and doing an oral dictation. There's a lot of repetition, and chiasms aren't really necessarily very complex. It's just a repetition. You go down one way, you come back the other way. Alma 36 gets this appearance of being chiastic and being a long, interesting chiasm, but it's not necessarily compelling in terms of passing the 3-factor test. And we'll, like I said, we'll dive into that. If that feels like a little bit of a weak address of that, it's because we're going to dive into that when we actually get to the Alma 36 section of Come Follow Me. Just know that's kind of where that's going to land. If and conditionals are actually like super interesting to me. Because I spent an inordinate amount of time looking into this. So there's an article by Royal Skousen published in like 1997 that talks about how in Hebrew you can construct a sentence where you have the if particle, and then you can close your conditional with this other particle that in a conditional statement would mean then, but in other places in Hebrew it can mean and. And so essentially you can have a grammatically correct if and conditional statement in Hebrew. And so if you see if and conditionals in the Book of Mormon, that's just evidence of it being Hebraic in origin. And in Helaman 12, there's this rather long section of these conditionals, this whole series of conditional statements. And when Joseph is writing these or dictating these, they come out as if and in their structure. So this fails. Like I said, we'll get into the list like really specifically. I'll break down like all the issues with this, but where this breaks down is first an intentionality, right? So did the author actually, and put in this Hebraic information or this Hebraic structure in the source text, which we can't really observe and actually look at. It's difficult to actually say. But we might expect it to show up in certain places. Like we would need to make an argument that like all of the places where if ands show up and all the places where they don't, it would make sense in the Hebrew for them to be structured that way. You would need to do this backwards construction and actually demonstrate that. You can't just take if and shows up, therefore it's Hebraic. You would have to do this reverse construction work and basically argue back to what the source text would have been, show that would actually be the case, which is a little bit problematic when this text is written in Reformed Egyptian. And so if you're doing these conditional statements, you would need to actually show that Egyptian would have this same structure, not Hebrew. And so that's an interesting problem. There's also the issue of it makes no sense to actually translate it that way, right? Just because this particle works in a conditional clause as then, but in another type of sentence would mean and, it doesn't make sense then that you would translate it ever as and. That's just bad translation. Again, this hits the intentionality side of that because it doesn't make sense as a translation. It does make a certain kind of sense if you've just kind of lost the ball on your long articulation, your long orally dictated sentence. And so you've got this like long lengthy sentence and you have if, and then you have a whole bunch of text in between that if statement, and then an and slips in as you're orally dictating just because you've lost the ball. Makes sense that way. It makes less sense as an actual translation. It would be very bad translation work. It's also not unique to Hebrew. There's a structure in Japanese for if and statements or if then statements where you can use a particle that means and in a lot of different places. And if you want to indicate that something is like an absolute 100% necessary consequence of another thing occurring. So, if you've got something like basically if a certain thing happens, it will necessarily follow that this other thing occurs. You can use this particle to construct that, and this particle often translates as and you would have a conditional clause structured in such a way to basically say if you were to do a really poor translation of the Japanese. So how do we know then that the Book of Mormon is not actually an ancient Japanese document and Joseph just had it completely wrong? That's a silly point, I know, but frankly, the argument coming from Royal Scouts is actually silly as well. And that's what I kind of hope that this illustrates, is that this is just it's a silly point to bring up. It's interesting to explore because, clever on the part of Royal Scouts, uh, but find me a place where anybody has ever actually translated the biblical Hebrew that where this and or this particle that means and, but can also be used in conditional clauses to mean then, shows up in a translation as something other than then, or shows up as and. It doesn't happen because it's just bad translation work. The other one that was interesting, or that I found interesting here, is Jershon. And again, when we get to the story of the people of Ammon showing up into the Nephite lands and being given the land of Jershon as an inheritance for their protection, we'll discuss in detail how this goes. But basically, the Jersh part of Jershon sounds or resembles the Hebrew word Yerash, and that Hebrew word Yerash it is one of the words that means inherit or inheritance. And so you could make the argument that what's going on in the text here in Alma is that they are calling Jershon a land of inheritance, and it will be given as an inheritance to the people of Ammon. Now, this fails just spectacularly, but it is fun to talk about as an issue for the three-factor test. So in terms of intentionality, does the author intend on this play on words about an inheritance and this land of inheritance and Yerashon? Well, there's a couple of issues. One is that the word that actually is most associated with Gershon in that section is defense or protection. That's the idea that is the most commonly associated with Gershon there. There is nothing in the text that links Gershon and inheritance as having some sort of meaning. It's not like there isn't anything that actually textually links them meaningfully any more than defense or protection would. So intentionality is a problem. The other issue is that Jershon is not the only land of inheritance, nor is it the land that is most commonly referred to as a land of inheritance. That actually falls to like the land of Nephi. That is referred to, I believe it's the land of Nephi that is the most commonly referred to as the land of inheritance, more so than any other land in the Book of Mormon. So why are we privileging Jershon other than sort of a special pleading case? So we're really missing on like intentionality. I would say like you do have uniqueness to Hebrew. It does pertain to Hebrew. So you do win on that front, and that obviously wouldn't be available in Joseph Smith's milieu. So you win on the unavailable in Joseph Smith's milieu, but a huge intentionality issue that I just don't think that can necessarily overcome, because the text doesn't support showing that was what was intended by the author to link intentionality, or to link Jershon intentionally with the concept, the idea of inheritance. We'll get into that in some detail. I'll really break that apart when we get there, and we'll look at some of the apologetic arguments for it. But the spoiler warning for it is that it does fail the three-factor test. So to compare, with the Apocalypse of Abraham, you have a clear provenance that associates it with a certain setting, widely recognized and understood within the scholarship. But the Book of Mormon is the sole example of its kind. There is nothing like the Book of Mormon, which take that as a compliment, honestly, for your support of the Book of Mormon. But yeah, there is nothing like it anywhere in the scholarship. In terms of the manuscripts that are available, so this is actually where I think there's a pretty strong similarity. You have two families of manuscripts for the Apocalypse of Abraham, and it's about 6 total manuscripts. And they support and kind of help each other with really divorcing it from any Slavonic context, which is kind of interesting. But with the Book of Mormon, you've got these other manuscripts that you have the publisher's manuscript, the original manuscript, and then you have the actual published Palmyra edition of the Book of Mormon. And all that's, it's separated from what it's supposed to be. It's separated from this Hebraic source, this or purportedly Hebraic source text, not unlike the Hebraic source text that would have originally been part of the pseudepigrapha tradition that would have created the Apocalypse of Abraham. The language that we actually have surviving for the Apocalypse of Abraham is Slavonic. We have King James English for the Book of Mormon. both of which are removed from what is supposed to be their source text. There are Hebraisms, we have chiasms, we have and it came to pass, and we have things that are supposed to enhance the textual meaning. And yet, in the cases of the Apocalypse of Abraham, we're able to actually pass them through the three-factor test. It's actually able to do that in a meaningful way that strengthens the text. Where the Book of Mormon side of it, none of them so far have been able to actually pass the three-factor test meaningfully, despite having similar pieces of evidence. Though I will say that for the Apocalypse of Abraham, it's much more strongly supported by idioms and syntactic structures. It's supported more strongly by evidence that actually enhances the meaning of the text, where the Book of Mormon is almost entirely, almost exclusively supported by syntax, idioms, those sorts of things. And those were, as noted, the weakest of the evidences for the Apocalypse of Abraham, being Hebraic. So there is one little piece of argumentation that came up in my discussions with the believers, and we'll go ahead and we'll go here to page 91. So there was a believer who criticized the three-factor test and said scholars do not use things like the three-factor test. It's silly. However, there is the scholar Davila who wants to argue for the Jewish origin of the Apocalypse of Abraham, and he uses 5 factors for things that you would actually look for. And then Paulson, so he's going to lay out these 5 factors, and then Davila comes through and actually shows that there are multiple lines of, or Davila lays those out. Paulson Reed goes through and shows that there are these lines of evidence that support what Davila is putting forward as factors that would lead to accepting Abraham as a Jewish text. So the first is substantial Jewish content of any kind, strong internal evidence that shows the work was composed in the pre-Christian era, which I like that actually as a criteria for the Book of Mormon, and is addressed in the intentionality as well as the uniqueness criteria for the three-factor test. Compelling evidence that the book was translated from Hebrew, which is what the three-factor test is trying to actually get after ultimately. Sympathetic concern with the Jewish ritual cult. So basically, the stuff that you would expect for a Jewish group to include in their text doesn't actually show up in the text. And I've argued in other places that you don't see that in the Book of Mormon really anywhere. And so far, there's been only like the most superficial arguments from scholars, from apologists that would support the Book of Mormon having any of that. Sympathetic concern with Jewish law, Torah, and Halakha. Yeah, the Book of Mormon really isn't that. It wants to run immediately to a Christian context, and it does that right from its opening pages. And if you go with the Mosaician priority theory, it does that literally from the first word. And then concern with Jewish ethnic and national interest, particularly self-identification as a Jew, polemics against Gentile persecution of Jews, and internal Jewish polemics. And we really don't see that in the Book of Mormon. If there are any polemics, it's actually against like a 19th century Christian argument. It's internal arguments against other Christians, not against like the Jews, against against Jewish thought. Certainly not the Jewish thought that would have been present in like the time of Nephi, which is definitely interesting. Anyway, so you have these 5 factors and that Davila is presenting, and all of those actually show up in the Apocalypse of Abraham. The Apocalypse of Abraham meets every single one of those features that Davila lays out. In a similar manner, I use the 3-factor test for basically just getting us to the point of even starting a scholarly discussion with the Book of Mormon. But to answer that critic of the 3-factor test, actually scholars do use these types of tests. They refine them. They basically create these criteria that they're going to be looking for. They can explain why they can defend that. And I think I can do that, or I think I have done that actually with the 3-factor test so far, and explain why those are there, how they were developed, and what they would actually mean as we go through. And And also, like, yeah, there are gradations to this that DeVille is putting forward, but also there's kind of just a binary. You either have these, you either meet these standards, or you don't. And that's the same thing with the three-factor test. All right. So really, despite just superficial similarities between the two texts, the Book of Mormon and the Apocalypse of Abraham, the nature of the Hebraisms that are actually in the text are just on completely different wavelengths, completely different levels. Such stronger evidence for a Hebraic source for Semitic origin with the Apocalypse of Abraham than shows up anywhere in the Book of Mormon. The Apocalypse of Abraham fits into a known and understood context. The Book of Mormon does not. It is the only thing of its kind. Nothing like it has ever been found, and there's nothing to substantiate the context that's argued for in the Book of Mormon, where the Apocalypse of Abraham fits neatly into what's something that's pretty well understood for arguing for its Semitic origin. And then when we take that three-factor test and we apply it to the Apocalypse of Abraham, we see Hebraisms that are passing that move beyond just mere biblicizing Greek. The same cannot be said for any of the proposed Hebraisms so far for the Book of Mormon, which doesn't move. We can't move any of those purported Hebraisms out of something like biblicizing English. And that would be the purpose, ultimately, of the three-factor test. So, yeah, I really hope that that helps with understanding the Book of Mormon and its Hebraic, really the arguments for a Hebraic origin for the Book of Mormon. Why I am really just completely unconvinced by the arguments that are put forward by apologists on that, and why I will continue to use the three-factor test until it actually gets shown to be something that's non-functional. Um, I haven't been able to break it. I would love to be able to break the three-factor test and to show that it doesn't work. It would be pretty exciting because then I would be able to work on something different or kind of move out of this space of really discussing Hebraisms whatsoever because I'm just a hobbyist at this. But near as I can tell, it holds and it's consistent with other scholarship. And when we apply it to other scholarly models, it continues to work. It works in ways that we would actually expect it to work. So I find that interesting. It doesn't apply to too many texts. You find me something else like the Apocalypse of Abraham, I would love to run it through and actually see how it works. It would work for other languages too. It doesn't need to be Hebrew per se. So if we're arguing about a text that we have only in English is actually like an ancient Sanskrit text, we can do the same run. We can run through the same process. Yeah, I would love to look at other examples of that. But here in this case with the Apocalypse of Abraham, we have a pretty clear example of the three-factor test working exactly as it's supposed to. And I'm not convinced that there's a problem yet. Open to it, definitely open to it. And I'm not exactly putting this forward as a scholarly level piece, but I think that it at least gets the conversation started. This is the thing that would remove you from, other contexts that could actually perfectly explain the origin of the text just fine. And since the Book of Mormon does not escape its biblicizing English context, I don't see a reason to start moving into arguing that it's, how good is this Hebraism for substantiating an ancient origin of the text? We're just not there yet. And frankly, I don't care how good your chiastic structure is at this point in time. It doesn't pass the three-factor test. We're not there yet. So anyway, that's enough for me for today. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, share this with all of your friends and neighbors, especially the ones who think that the Book of Mormon has a Hebraic origin. I would love to engage with folks on this. And yeah, thank you so much. And I will see you in the next one.